Welcome to Lesson 5 of Module 3, Biological Diversity. In this video, we're going to be looking at the theory of evolution by natural selection, and specifically, we're going to be looking at Charles Darwin and his voyages, which allowed him to obtain data of the finches of the Galapagos Islands and Australian flora and fauna, which allowed him to support his theory of evolution by natural selection. The meta language which we're going to use in this video today, so natural selection. So this is the idea that species were not created in their present forms, but had evolved from ancestral species, and the influence of environmental pressures on allele frequency in a population. A niche is the environment of an organism and the role they play in their environment. Adaptive radiation is where a single species evolves into several species by adapting to the requirements of different environmental niches. A genotype is the combination of alleles in an organism that determine the phenotype. The gene pool is all of the genetic variation or the alleles in a population, and the allele frequency is the proportion of the gene pool that carries that allele relative to other alleles for that gene. So Charles Darwin formed the theory of natural selection, which was the mechanism for evolution. We now accept this as the best explanation for the origin of species and how they have adapted to their environment. And this theory has four main components. The first is that in any population, there are variations, or the members of one species are not identical. Number two, in any generation, there are offspring that do not reach maturity and reproduce. The characteristics of these organisms are removed from the population. Three, those organisms that survive and reproduce are well adapted to that environment. They have favorable variations, which is also termed survival of the fittest. And these favorable variations are passed on to offspring. They become more and more common in the population. So the voyage of the HMS Beagle, this is where Charles Darwin and the voyage in which he went on, which allowed him to collect lots of the data, which we still refer to today. So this voyage departed England in December 1831 and returned in October 1836. It allowed Darwin to survey South Africa, large portions of Southern America, Tahiti, Australia, New Zealand, and most famously, the Galapagos archipelago. Darwin took extensive notes on his observations and collected thousands of specimens, including geological and fossil evidence. The most prominent of his observations were the finches of the Galapagos Island. He collected these specimens of bird across the Galapagos, which he later found, due to the help of John Gould, that there are slight variations to each other. John Gould helped Darwin to make observations of beak size and their length and viewed this along with his records of the types of food available on each island. The differing forms of the beaks were the traits altered by natural selection, and this was because each environment had different forms of food available, which provided the selection pressures for the birds. So we can see here that there was a common ancestor from Southern American mainland, and we see that over time, the beaks of these birds actually changed to, in fact, be all different shapes and sizes, and this relates to the types of seeds that they were eating in each of the different environments within the Galapagos Islands. So when Darwin visited Australia, Darwin observed several platypus that were playing in a river, and he noted that these occupied a similar environmental niche to what he referred to as the English water rat. And he was struck by the observation that these animals existed in very similar environments, but in fact, they actually don't look like one another at all. And so Darwin, from his observations, he noticed that animals from the same region could closely resemble one another, even if they existed in very different environments. And animals in distant regions could look very different, even if they existed in very similar environments. So the genetics of natural selection. Sometimes there is a particular phenotype that gives an individual a survival advantage. And this phenotype, along with all the genes and alleles that are responsible and control it, are likely to survive in the population. Any of these organisms that are able to survive are more likely to breed, and that increases the chance that these phenotypes will be inherited by their offspring, which in turn allows these offspring to be more successful than those with less useful phenotypes. Selection pressures, as we know, together with mutation, are the driving force of evolution. So Darwin and Wallace, who are credited for the work of the theory of evolution by natural selection made two great inferences. The first is that individuals who inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. And this unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits in the population over generations. So, if we do a summary of natural selection does not involve intent. No one actually goes about trying to select a characteristic. It merely rewards whatever has already survived with ongoing survival. Selection does not work for the survival of a species. The mechanism favors individual survival and reproduction. Natural selection does not always lead to greater complexity or sophistication. Um, the fitness that Darwin refers to does not mean athletic fitness. Fitness is an evolutionary context, which in fact actually means the suitability for a particular environment. Genetic variation not affecting the phenotype is selectively invisible and may accumulate over time, and not all traits serve a survival function. That concludes lesson 5. Make sure you tune in for lesson 6.